Welcome to this week's edition of Unbound Radio's Webster Tarpley Program. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. Now, we have a number of important international stories this week, and most of them have to do with the world economic depression, understood in the broadest sense. And remember, it goes like this. If you look back to the 1930s, you will see a process that takes place in three phases. And of course, there's not exactly a complete curtain that comes down and a new chapter is open for each one of them. They interpenetrate, they mix, but the basic idea is this. You go from a time where the primary reality is world economic depression, deflation, high unemployment, mass misery, crumbling of political institutions, and then the birth of irrationalist, fanatical mass movements. And then very soon you get into the second phase, where the big action is focused on the creation of dictatorships, where representative governments, democracies, and so forth really cease to exist. And you've got dictatorships, right? And you can see this in Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany. Remember, just about every country on the continent of Europe had become fascist or authoritarian in some form by the end of the 1930s. So there's your second phase. But then, given the internal dynamic, or the combination of ongoing depression and the needs of demagogic totalitarian leaders, then you're headed towards world war. And in our own time, it seems like we're getting a pretty good dose of each one of those three elements. But that's essentially what we're looking at. Now, the practical point, though, is you better intervene in the first phase. You better not wait for the second phase of the dictatorship and then think that you're going to accomplish something, because you won't. It's too late to organize politically by the time your dictatorship becomes consolidated. And by the time you get into war, right, everybody who might be opposing a dictator has already been drafted into the army or mobilized in some other way. So there it is. It's time to intervene now with a recovery program. The two elements of the recovery program, as proposed by the United Front Against Austerity, are, first of all, the Wall Street sales tax. Take 1% out of every Wall Street transaction, every speculative trade that goes across the New York, Chicago exchanges, stocks, bonds, derivatives, futures, options, indices, the entire array of stuff. With this, you get about $1 trillion. With that, you have essentially stabilized the federal and state budgets. You don't need austerity. You don't need to attack old people, widows, orphans, the disabled war veterans, and other things in the way that is going on under the Obama budget, as well as the Ryan budget and the Rand Paul budget, and these other budgets that essentially all converge on this. And then your second phase is you want to get a recovery. You've got to have somebody to finance the recovery. Well, the zombie banks can't do it. The federal budget can't do it. And that, therefore, means you've got to open up one of these credit windows, credit stimulus at the Federal Reserve, and use that money to create 30 million jobs building infrastructure. That's it in a nutshell. Now, if we look at the current moment, we can see that one of our big stories I'd like to talk about later in the show is the Italian coup, right? We've just had a coup by the International Monetary Fund and the European Central Bank in Italy. We've just gone from a prime minister by the name of Monti, who represents the Bilderberg Group, then the Trilateral Commission, and his replacement is a member of the Democratic Party, the PD, the Social Democrats or the Neo-Communists, who also represents the Bilderberg and Trilateral. So we'll be back with more about that in just a minute on the Webster Tarpley Program. I'm here on Unbound Radio. Now I want to direct your attention, as always, to Tarpley.net. Tarpley.net, that is the touchstone for keeping up with world events and making some sense out of them, understand what's going on around you at Tarpley.net. And indeed, in times like these, when things are moving fast, take a look at Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed, which you should follow. And I'm happy to announce that I just passed the 11,000 mark this past week. 11,000 people get these Twitters when I put them out. And it's a very broad range of stuff. Some things you won't find anywhere else. Other things are the fruits of, other aggregations of other things. But Tarpley.net on the website, and then Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Now, Italy has therefore gone from a prime minister, Monti, an austerity ghoul, who has increased unemployment by 2 full percentage points in a period of just a little bit over 14, 15 months. And now we've got Enrico Letta, L-E-T-T-A, who is, like Monti, a member of the Bilderberg and the Trilateral. And this is very interesting to see how this works. All of this takes place under the auspices of President Napolitano. Now, we don't know whether he's a relative of Janet Napolitano, but this is President Napolitano of Italy is a former communist. Henry Kissinger once described him as my favorite communist. Henry Kissinger's favorite commie, president of Italy, and he is playing the role of von Hindenburg in the Weimar Republic back in the 1920s and 30s. Right, when you go into a crisis where the mechanisms of parliamentary government break down. It's a very interesting point that the British model parliamentary government, where the parliament essentially creates a prime minister who's got to keep a majority in the parliament and who could lose it at any point. He's always got to look over his shoulder and see if he's losing his majority. Is he going to be able to survive a vote of no confidence? That is a very unstable system, and we're very lucky to have a system in the United States which, in effect, manufactures majorities, even if they're not so clearly there. But in the case of the parliament, it's oligarchical in the sense that it says we have to make sure that everybody's represented. And this is not really the only thing that government has to do. Government has to represent the various groups and opinions in the population, but it's also got to be able to take decisions. In other words, these things have got to be resolved one way or another. Something has to happen, and then you have to move on. So under the Italian system, we've been in a phase of great instability. At the end of Berlusconi, you'll recall, Draghi took over the European Central Bank, and as soon as Draghi did that, he was not nicer to his own country, Italy, but since he was from Goldman Sachs, he plunged his dagger into the back of his own countrymen by essentially not supporting Italian bonds when he took over the European Central Bank. And it went very fast. Within about 24, 48 hours, there was a crisis of the Italian state debt simply because the European Central Bank refused to do the obvious thing and support those bonds. And given the hysteria around that, the fear of bankruptcy, the fear of Greece, Greek conditions and so forth, the Parliament then turned against Berlusconi and ousted him. And at that point, Henry Kissinger's favorite communist, Napolitano, said, well, let's have a technocratic government, right? Let's have something that Italy had never had. Let's have some professors who are not members of any party, but who represent economic expertise. We'll bring them in, and we'll get Monti from the main Italian business school, the Bocconi in Milan, bring him in, make him prime minister, and let her rip, right? Killer austerity, genocidal cuts, and he went to town on that. And the result now is, at the end of all that, as I say, 2 percentage points increased in unemployment, production down, all the bad indices are up, all the good indices are down. There's a colossal failure, and it's Weimarization. In other words, the basis of the previous democratic institutions are being destroyed. One obvious thing is that in Weimar, everybody noticed the parties of the center get destroyed. right? The people that are between the Nazis and the communists and the Social Democrats. All the other little ones basically get chewed up, except the Catholics. But in Italy today, the sort of intermediate parties have just disappeared. Not that they were any good, but it is a process of Weimarization. So last Saturday, President Napolitano had been watching the attempt to elect the President of the Republic. And it's very interesting. The President of the Republic is a 7-year term. Napolitano had just finished his term. He's 87 years old. And he said last Saturday morning, he said, okay, I give up. I'm going to stand. I'm going to run for a second term. And he did. And he immediately got elected. This was a coup d'etat because he's now got these emergency powers, and he's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He has all kinds of institutional powers. He's the number one judge in the country. He runs the affairs of all the judges, which is a kind of a semi-independent group under the Italian system. Anyway, he then comes out and says, I want Enrico Letta to be the prime minister. And that's who we have now. Now, Letta, as I say, he continues this wonderful tradition that the Italian prime minister has got to be a member not only of the Bilderberger group, but also of the Trilateral Commission, and if possible has got to have close links to the Aspen Institute. The Aspen Institute being the think tank or sort of, political education arm of the Bilderberger. It's a little bit more out in the open, a little bit less secretive. So that is now Letta, and he has formed his government as of this past Saturday, and it's expected that the votation, the vote of confidence in the houses of the Italian Chamber of Deputies, that's going to happen, and we've got the PD, the Democratic Party, is going to vote for this guy Letta, who is their guy. He comes from that party. And the Berlusconi Party, the People of Liberty, are going to vote for him. Now, between those two, they are between 65, 70% of the vote, right? That leaves Grillo with his 25% or so. So this government is going to be formed. Now, what kind of a government will it be? Unfortunately, because of the failure here of any political force really in Italy to come forward with a recovery program, and that could include and should include a recovery program targeting the European Central Bank and forcing them to help finance a recovery, in addition to massively gearing up the existing Euro-Tobin, the existing financial transaction tax, right, taking it from about, 0.1% to at least 1% and quite possibly more. Because you don't have any programmatic intervention like that to roll back austerity, the new Letta government is going to continue the IMF, European Central Bank austerity of Monti. So we go from one trilateral Bilderberg to a second trilateral Bilderberg. And, of course, the main opposition is Grillo. And to put it, maybe to keep the overview simple, the controller of Grillo's controller is also from the Aspen Institute and therefore is in odor of Bilderberg. And he's also from the Harvard Business Review. I'm talking about Enrico Sassoon, who is the controller of Casaleggio, and Casaleggio is the controller of Grillo. So this doesn't look so good. And one key job is that of economics minister. And the economics minister in the new Letta government is a guy called Saccomanni. And Saccomanni comes from the Bank of Italy. So he is a certified austerity ghoul. Now, with Monti, we knew what he was, right? He was a professor of economics, full of Austrian, monetarist, neoliberal ideology, all these bankrupt views. In the case of Letta, it's a little bit more complicated because he comes from the wreckage of the old Christian Democratic Party, and his guru, the sponsor of his career, was a guy called Andreatta, and Andreatta was a Christian technocrat, Christian Democratic technocrat, and therefore predisposed towards austerity. Letta also created a kind of a context. He had a network of think tanks and study organizations and lobbies and so forth to serve as a springboard for his seizure of power. And that's a group called 360, and also he's got a think tank called Vedro. So Vedro is there. For those of you who know my work on Italian terrorism, Andreatta is one of the creators of the University of Trent, which is the incubator for the Red Brigade. So interesting that Andreatta had the University of Trento going, and now he's got his Andreatta is no longer with us. I think he's been dead for about 20 years now, but he's now got his man Letta as the Italian prime minister. Now, this is Weimarization. This is a form of government which is increasingly dictatorial, increasingly alien to the concerns of everyday working people. And from this, we have to realize democracy is in grave danger. It is. Depression, dictatorship, world war. It is impossible to maintain democratic representative government in a period of sustained high unemployment. And when you hear the anti-government rhetoric, the anti-Congress rhetoric, and so forth, you have to think about what that means in terms of preparing the ground, not just for more and more complaining, but for some kind of a coup of the type that we've just had. We've now had Napolitano with one coup in November 2011 to bring in Monti, and now at the age of 87, he's still capable of a second coup the other Saturday, and then within 1 week, he's got Letta, a new international financial operative, installed. So if you don't want that, you need the things that I've been telling you about. Program. You got to have your own program to get out of a depression. You've got to have some kind of an organization so that you can act. I recommend for the moment the United Front Against Austerity. You better have a strategy, which is, seems to me, to promote the collapse of the Republican Party and then the split of the Democrats into two parts. That, I think, makes some sense. And then you got to have some ideas of leadership, if only the idea that there should be leaders, that somebody who's telling you there shouldn't be leaders is probably an anarchist and therefore a wrecker. Now, when we look at the U.S., the way in which the fascistization has been coming, it has focused significantly on these Midwestern states with extreme reactionary Republican governors, right? It starts off with Walker, right? Walker of Wisconsin and his union-busting campaign of early 2011. And a huge mobilization to get him out, but since the mobilization depended on still there, although he's been significantly boxed in. And then we've got Governor Snyder, Rick Snyder of Michigan, of Gateway Computer, of course, just like Grillo, right? Cybernetic authoritarian. And it also indicates these people tend to be autistic personalities, again, like Casaleggio, Grillo, but also Snyder. So we've been following the dictatorship in Detroit now under Kevin Orr, financial dictatorship, all power, legislative, executive, concentrated in one dictatorial figure. This is bad. But now what we're seeing in Massachusetts with the Boston Marathon is, in effect, fascistization of a different kind of state, right? You can't expect to do it the same way, right? Wisconsin and Michigan are one thing, but Massachusetts is another. So here we are on Unbound Radio, the Webster Tarpley Program, coming to you from Washington, D.C. Therefore, this circus around the Boston Marathon bombings, it is an event of limited dimensions. Obviously, tragic loss of life, tragic wounding of people. We condemn terrorism, and we really do. And we do something to fight it. And we don't support it. We don't support it anywhere. Not in Libya, not in Syria, not in Boston, not anywhere. So here the idea was to hype it. We now have, this actually became a theme of the White House Correspondents' Dinner a couple of days ago, that CNN has been mocked for their really amateurish way of doing this. Turns out that there was a CNN reporter who was sitting there with the police radio, and he was just repeating every raw, unchecked, unconfirmed shred of hype that he could get off this police radio, and just putting that out on CNN, right? 6 to 8 bombs found along the route of the marathon. And nothing of the sort was ever then was ever shown. But you could see the networks. All of a sudden, the North Korean crisis, the DPRK, Kim Jong-un, who had been there bread and meat for a couple of weeks, all of that disappears. Time to bore in, time to hone in on this Boston tragedy. So you can see what they were trying to do, right? The goal of it, as I've tried to point out, is a strategy of tension. And we can just recapitulate what some of these things are. You've got, you can take it back to, as far back as you want. But certainly this North Korean crisis, that looms large as a kind of a prelude to this, right? So you got the DPRK, then you've got the Boston Marathon bombing, you got the Ricin letters to the White House and the Congress, you've got soon after that the blowing up of this textile fertilizer plant in Texas. And then you've got this amazing story from Canada that Al-Qaeda of Iran has plotting to blow up a train going from New York City to Toronto. Except there is no Al-Qaeda in Iran, and I don't care what Peter Bergen says. Peter Bergen has written an article about strange bedfellows, Al-Qaeda and Iran. Well, that is absolutely fantastic, but you can see what they're trying to do, right? And again, if the Boston bomber had turned out to be a North Korean, I think that would have been clear to a lot of people. But a Chechen, in many ways, just as bad. So we've also got that very strange Twitter that tanked the stock market 160 points. That's a very interesting one, because that's practically a signature that what you're seeing is a strategy of tension, right? If anybody believes that was some odd lone wolf hacker doing that, I would be very skeptical of that. This seems to me to be an absolutely key ingredient in stirring the pot, as these people like to say, right? Can manufacture a convergence of crises. The big thing to understand about this is that the official story is impossible. Remember, I talked about this last week. If you look at my 9/11 synthetic terror made in USA, you will see the United States, the CIA, MI6 of the British. These are the sponsors of Chechen independence terrorism, terrorist movements in Chechnya designed to secure the independence of that area from the Russian Federation. And this goes back, it really goes back 150 years. Right? The British have been doing this for a very long time in that part of the world. The U.S. has come in somewhat later. So this is an Anglo-American project going on in Chechnya. Now, the other thing, of course, is the Obama campaign specifically. Since the Obama campaign establishment is so concerned through figures like Zbigniew Brzezinski with the so-called captive nations, not of the Warsaw Pact and not of the Soviet Union, but now of the Russian Federation, those captive nations, Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, Ossetia, and so forth, right? These connections, therefore, go from the Chechens to the Obama campaign through people like Brzezinski and the entire Brzezinski clan. And in the past week, we did have Russia Today pointing out that Ilyas Akhmadov, the ambassador of Basayev, a notorious CIA agent and terrorist in Chechnya, this Ilyas Akhmadov living here in the Washington area with a stipend and all expenses paid by the State Department. So that already, that's, I think, the indispensable frame of reference. The next thing, of course, is if you look at Chechen militants, suppose the U.S. has a stable of Chechen militants, and the British too. Where do they keep them? Well, first of all, they want to keep them in the Caucasus, Transcaucasus. They can keep them in Georgia, right? They can keep them in Chechnya, in Dagestan. They can keep them in these other smaller areas. They can keep them inside Russia. There are about 130,000 Chechen refugees, so-called, in Europe, and certainly some of those can be mobilized. The Chechens here in the United States seem to number in the low thousands. That is my impression. Hard to get real figures. But in this case, they it looks like they are the elite. In other words, if you come to the United States, you get asylum as a Chechen refugee, you're in a very, very special position. This is not automatic. Most of them have to, make do with Europe, but in this case, no, you're not going to be succeeding here in getting into the United States. So anybody who gets in is getting special treatment. Again, Ilyas Akhmadov is a very good example. So if you're a Chechen and you get to come to the United States and you get to get permanent asylum, a green card, and all that, and of course if you get a Reagan Fassel stipend like Ilyas Akhmadov did, well, that indicates that you're part of the elite of these people. What can we say? We now know that the Russian Federation called the attention of the FBI and the CIA to these two brothers, the Tsarnaev brothers, especially to Tamerlane, not once but twice. Tamerlane went to Russia twice, once in 2011 or thereabouts, and then for the first half, January through July of 2012. And in between, based on having observed him when he was there, the FSB, most likely, the KGB successor organization, Internal Counterintelligence Directorate, first sent an inquiry to the FBI. What do you know about Tamerlane Tsarnaev? Can we please hear more about him? And then later on sent an inquiry from the FSB to the CIA. It's quite possible that there was a third inquiry on Tamerlane, and it looks like there was also an inquiry from the FSB about Tamerlane's mother, this loudmouth, vehement, pugnacious woman that we see, right, who has apparently had the Russians have taped one of her discussions about jihad, whatever that means, one way or another. So at that point, if the FBI then fails to observe Tamerlane, what can we conclude? Can we conclude that it was just, the 90-day limit beyond which nothing can be done? No. You can always create some kind of an exception. You can always launch a sting operation. That would be the normal thing to do for the FBI. They're always hungry for sting operations. Well, what can explain it? The failure to connect the dots? We're hearing all the idiotic cliches of the 9/11 period brought up again. I would suggest the answer is simple. Moles. There are moles in the FBI. There are moles in the FBI who are not loyal to the national command structure or the Constitution or legality, but they march to the tune of a private Wall Street-controlled network. That's the invisible government. That's the rogue network. That's the invisible or parallel government that I've been writing about since, since the 70s, but in particular in 9/11 synthetic terror made in USA. What we need is a mole detector at the FBI. The FBI molehill is perfectly capable of shielding patsies. As a matter of fact, that's what moles get paid to do. If you're a mole, the first thing you have to do is that at the moment that Tamerlan Tsarnaev becomes a patsy who's going to be used in some kind of an operation, then you've got to prevent him from being arrested, shut down, boxed in, or otherwise limited in his activities. So the working hypothesis can only be that the FBI mole network decided to shield these two and to make sure that the two inquiries, not one but two that we know of, and probably more, inquiries from Russia come to nothing. And then we have this other interesting story. Now, I have not been able to evaluate some of this stuff completely, but it's interesting enough. We have people from the 9/11 Truth Movement. Remember Daniel Hopsicker, who he had an unfortunate intervention at the San Francisco conference of 9 years ago now, right? Almost 10 years. Next year it'll be the 10th anniversary of that San Francisco 9/11 conference. But Hopsicker came to that with a lot of interesting things about Atta's girlfriend, and the various airfields there in Venice, Florida, and places like that, where obviously Iran-Contra shipments were being carried on well into the... This is Hopsicker. And Hopsicker has had his ups and downs, but he's still going again with the Mad Cow Morning News and bombers. In last week's attack, Ruslan Sarny was married to the daughter of former top CIA official Graham Fuller. Now, the uncle, you'll remember him. Ruslan was the guy who came on the air a couple of Fridays ago and said, these nephews of mine are misfits, they're losers, they can't assimilate, they can't settle themselves in the United States. And then, all right, so the finding is that this Ruslan Sarny, and it's Sarny, Tsarnaev, it's got to do with some Russian noun declensions, but you get the idea. It's the same family. Sarny, Tsarnaev, same difference. Let's look at some obvious things about Graham Fuller. He is from the CIA. He was the station chief in Kabul for the CIA, Afghanistan. Fuller is credited with diversion of drug running and gun running. He was in the State Department after that and the CIA for 27 years. He joined the RAND Corporation as a senior. This is the saga of Ruslan Tsarny, the uncle of the two boys, who seems to have married into a rather high-level CIA State Department family. Washington Post says he's a media maven. There's a certain admiration for him from the press corps. Anyway, there you go. Now, I would also say it's not a question of whether it's the Saudi or the Armenian or Uncle Ruslan. It can be all of these. The Saudi who was there, who was tackled, could have been, an observer sent by Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal, could have been an envoy of Prince Naif or others, right? Prince Talal. There are all kinds of people, and their families, of course, if they're not around. The Saudi is one count. The Saudi is the one that Glenn Beck is pushing, and you can see that he wants this to be the key person, because this will allow him to pursue his Islamophobia agenda. Now, since Glenn Beck is a top Mormon, we can assume that Glenn Beck is getting material from the Mormon faction of the FBI, but this is just as likely to be serious disinformation as anything else. But again, we want to keep an open mind, but we're very unconvinced by Glenn Beck, a very malodorous and demagogic personality. In the realm of other media commentators that we wanted to evaluate, Sybil Edmonds of the Boiling Frog program, and one of her sidekicks, a guy with some philosophical pretensions, which unfortunately are not borne out. In the case of Sybil Edmonds, her line is that this is what we're getting is a dirty deal between Putin of Russia and the United States. And her line, I think, it's a substantially anti-Russian line, and it goes something like this. Russia is concerned with the terrorist rebellion there in Chechnya, in that ethnic labyrinth of the southern Caucasus and the Caucasus in general, right? That country like Dagestan has 30 different language groups speaking mutually unintelligible languages. So you got 30 different language groups in Dagestan. So Sybil Edmonds is saying, look, the Russians take this very seriously. They would do anything to quiet that Chechen rebellion. And she's arguing the Russians are going to acquiesce. They're going to allow and connive with the U.S. in attacking Syria very soon. I would regard that as not proven, and coming from anybody, especially whistleblowers coming out of the U.S. intelligence community, the Russian line, the anti-Russian line, is always a giveaway, and it's not good to get sucked into that stuff. I've also seen people online saying, oh, the Russians, how can they negotiate? They've got to stop talking to the arsonists, right? The arsonists are burning down the house. How can you talk to them? Well, in statecraft, you got to remember what Cardinal Richelieu said back, in the 1600s. And he said the thing that you've always got to remember is the tremendous advantage that a government gets by negotiating with everybody all the time. Good faith, bad faith, you always learn something, you always gain advantages for yourself. Negotiation is not a gift to anybody, it's a gift to yourself. So I would discount most of Glenn Beck's argument, this stuff, he's got this gobbledygook about what forms were opened up for this the Saudi suspect. By the way, there's another Saudi who was a student at Brown University, and the student at Brown University was fingered by a website which had been set up, basically a vigilante website in in Boston, about, let's solve the Boston bombings, and that poor kid, that Saudi, was then found drowned, dead. So this is extremely suspicious. But again, Beck and his Saudi, keep an eye on the Saudi, but forget Beck. Sybil Edmonds and her attempt at diplomatic analysis, not so great, won't hold water for a while. And then this leads us finally to the other great question, right? If we have a strategy of tension going, which is the argument here, this obviously to suppress a strike wave, to suppress mass resistance to austerity measures, other kinds of mass mobilization that are now within reach in many places, right? We've got a strike wave going in fast food. It started in New York City. It's now in Chicago. It may go elsewhere. If that comes to your neighborhood, support it, and indeed go talk to them about the Wall Street sales tax, without which they will not be able to win any significant demands. So the other aspect, though, the other thing that's supposed to happen, right, the greatest diversion of them all, right, as we know, right, the Orwellian diversion, the one that tends to shut down the internal class struggle, I guess, at least for a while, and make it harder, as we've seen, is war. And war, in this case, means Syria. Now we've got this really threadbare report. The British are convinced, the French are convinced, the Israelis are convinced, they all want to be convinced, that Assad has used chemical weapons against these wonderful freedom fighters. Now remember, the freedom fighters are Al-Qaeda in many cases, right? Their main force armed units, the Nusra Brigade, that's Al-Qaeda. Those are terrorists that have been used cynically by NATO as infantry in attacking Syria. So don't fall for that. I'm actually wondering if they do a survey and find out that the Nusra Brigade are the ones who used chemical weapons that they captured or brought in or got from Saudi Arabia or whatever it is, will the U.S. then bomb the Al-Qaeda terrorists of the Nusra Brigade? Interesting questions. But the main thing is we got to do something to stop this war. And again, anybody who's got a phone, anybody who's got a computer, you get on Twitter, you get on other social media, Facebook and so forth. Take back the airwaves. Get on there, C-SPAN, get on there with the various reactionary or pseudo-progressive voices of the afternoon. Get on there and refute that. And anybody can do it. So this is the word coming from the United Front against austerity. So we'll be back in just a minute with some more considerations about how to stop this war with Syria, this the Webster Tarpley Program on Unbound Radio. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program here on Unbound Radio. So, war with Syria. Notice Obama, as always, reticent, cautious. What does it mean? That he's less of a warmonger than Bush? I don't think this is the main point. I'm afraid to say, when we had that opening of the Bush the Younger Library in Dallas at Southern Methodist University, when we had the five presidents, present and former, that are still around, be they Carter, Bush the Elder, Bush the Younger, Clinton, and Obama, what you got was the sense of a ruling class which had been torn apart under Bush, Cheney, and the neocons, and to some extent torn with Obama, but they seem to agree on austerity on the one hand and war on the other. There seems to be a kind of emerging consensus that people will go along. Some people might not like it, but they're not going to rock the boat too much. That's a very bad situation to be in, but that's now the situation. Library was that. It is a bankrupt ruling class. They're incapable of putting people to work, right? The main thing you'd expect from a ruling class is that they would want to get maximum economic value out of the people they have. This is a rule. The strategy is leading from behind. What does that mean? Obama is attracting the ire of the old-fashioned warmonger types like McCain and so forth, because he wants to lead from behind. In other words, run change of my evaluation of you. What is he trying to do? It seems to me he wants Turkey out in front. Turkey is the country that is slated to be destroyed, broken up, going in that direction. And Obama would like to have the British, the French, and the Turks out in front. And Obama would be leading from behind, pretty much in the way that happened in. So the long and the short of it is Obama leads from behind. He's trying to push Turkey into the front rank in the attack on Syria. He wants to push Britain and France into the front rank. He'd like to have Lebanon in the front rank. He'd like to have Jordan in the front rank, and so forth. So this is it's a scorched earth strategy, and McCain just doesn't understand that this is a deliberate posture designed to get these other allies to go into the meat grinder first. The other thing I should have mentioned under the Tamerlane heading, right, Tamerlane Tsarnaev, is that it has now been discovered by the Russian newspaper Izvestia. Remember, that used to be the government newspaper. Pravda was the party, Izvestia was the government, Red Star was the military, you remember. This now is Viestia, and they say that Tamerlane attended a conference co-sponsored by the Caucasus Fund and the Jamestown Foundation. Now, the Caucasus Fund of Georgia is accused by the Russians of being a hotbed of anti-Russian hysteria and inciting all kinds of fighters, terrorists, and so forth to come forward, essentially separatists. You get the idea. And then the Jamestown Foundation. Now, the Jamestown Foundation comes out of the United States here. William Casey is one of the key founders. There were two founders. One of them is William Casey. William Casey, of course, OSS, was the head of CIA under Ronald Reagan, was the head of CIA during the Iran-Contra phase. And then we've got Arkady Shevchenko, Russian dissident. So they're the ones present at the creation. Later on, along comes Zbigniew Brzezinski. Izvestia says that Soros, the Ford Foundation, put money into this. And, of course, we have to mention in this context what I think we mentioned in the previous broadcast, the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, another Brzezinski neocon operation. That's an interesting one because it's actually a united front between the Brzezinskyites and the neocons, often disagreeing, but in this case, absolutely agreeing that you got to maximize your capability of destabilizing the Caucasus and the Trans-Caucasus. So this is where we are now. So it's important for people to understand that this Boston story stinks to high heaven, that the FBI is a molehill, that these boys look like patsies. They may be, of course, fanatics, psychotics, double agents, criminal elements. There are any number of other categories. But ultimately, there's no proof that they did any of these things, right? We don't have a picture of one of these people depositing a bomb. We're sort of at the level of non-proof that we had in the London 7/7 of 2005, where you're showing these kids with backpacks. They may think that they're taking part in a drill. You have no idea. You have to have a very rigorous category of proof, and we don't have proof. So don't accept that story. But above all, don't be chilled by it, right? Don't allow yourself to be sucked into a bunker mentality or isolated siege thinking or anything of the sort. It's pointless. And then the other one is Syria. We're not interested. I'm sorry. We're not convinced of chemical weapons. And in this case, chemical weapons are the national deterrent of Syria. They have now been under aggravated attack. They have been assaulted, invaded, infiltrated by these foreign fighters. Very interesting that quite a few of the foreign fighters are Chechens. I've even got some articles which I've been sending out on Twitter. If you go to my Twitter feed, you will find it. There's one called Al Monitor, AL-Monitor. Last week, an armed group of Chechen fighters was behind the kidnapping of two bishops, one Orthodox, one Syriac, both Christians, in the Syrian province of Aleppo. So we've got all those different Chechens that have joined the Pakistani Taliban and the Libyan killers and God knows what in Syria. Are you going to arm them? Are you going to reward them? I say no. And it's another way of saying, hands off Syria, not one dime, not one man, not one rocket for the various terrorist group now operating in Syria. So, good to be with you again this week. See you next week on the Webster Tarpley Program, Unbound Radio. Welcome to this week's edition of Unbound Radio's Webster Tarpley Program. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. Now, we have a number of important international stories this week, and most of them have to do with the world economic depression, understood in the broader sense. And remember, it goes like this. If you look back to the 1930s, you will see a process that takes place in 3 phases. And of course, there's not exactly a complete curtain that comes down and a new chapter is open for each one of them. They interpenetrate, they mix, but the basic idea is this. You go from a time where the primary reality is world economic depression, deflation, high unemployment, mass misery, crumbling of political institutions, and then the birth of irrationalist, fanatical mass movements. And then very soon you get into the second phase, where the big action is focused on the creation of dictatorships, where representative governments, democracies, and so forth really cease to exist. And you've got dictatorships, right? And you can see this in Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany. Remember, just about every country on the continent of Europe had become fascist or authoritarian in some form by the end of the 1930s. So there's your second phase. But then, given the internal dynamic, or the combination of ongoing depression and the needs of demagogic totalitarian leaders, then you're headed towards world war. And in our own time, it seems like we're getting a pretty good dose of each one of those 3 elements. But that's essentially what we're looking at. Now, the practical point, though, is you better intervene in the first phase. You better not wait for the second phase of the dictatorship and then think that you're going to accomplish something, because you won't. It's too late to organize politically by the time your dictatorship becomes consolidated. And by the time you get into war, right, everybody who might be opposing a dictator has already been drafted into the army or mobilized in some other way. So there it is. It's time to intervene now with a recovery program. The 2 elements of the recovery program, as proposed by the United Front Against Austerity, are, first of all, the Wall Street sales tax. Take 1% out of every Wall Street transaction, every speculative trade that goes across the New York, Chicago exchanges, stocks, bonds, derivatives, futures, options, indices, the entire array of stuff. With this, you get about $1 trillion. With that, you have essentially stabilized the federal and state budgets. You don't need austerity. You don't need to attack old people, widows, orphans, the disabled war veterans, and other things in the way that is going. My favorite communist, Henry Kissinger's favorite commie, president of Italy, and he is playing the role of von Hindenburg in the Weimar Republic back in the 1920s and 30s, right? When you go into a crisis where the mechanisms of parliamentary government break down. It's a very interesting point that the British model parliamentary government, where the parliament essentially creates a prime minister who's got to keep a majority in the parliament and who could lose it at any point. He's always got to look over his shoulder and see if he's losing his majority. Is he going to be able to survive a vote of no confidence? That is a very unstable system, and we're very lucky to have a system in the United States which, in effect, manufactures majorities, even if they're not so clearly there. But in the case of the parliament, it's oligarchical in the sense that it says we have to make sure that everybody's represented. And this is not really the only thing that government has to do. Government has to represent the various groups and opinions in the population, but it's also got to be able to take decisions. In other words, these things have got to be resolved one way or another. Something has to happen, and then you have to move on. So under the Italian system, we've been in a phase of great instability. At the end of Berlusconi, you'll recall, Draghi took over the European Central Bank, and as soon as Draghi did that, he was not nicer to his own country, Italy, but since he was from Goldman Sachs, he plunged on under the Obama budget, as well as the Ryan budget and the Rand Paul budget, and these other budgets that essentially all converge on this. And then your second phase is you want to get a recovery. You've got to have somebody to finance the recovery. Well, the zombie banks can't do it. The federal budget can't do it. And that, therefore, means you've got to open up one of these credit windows credit stimulus at the Federal Reserve and use that money to create 30 million jobs building infrastructure. That's it in a nutshell. Now, if we look at the current moment, we can see that one of our big stories I'd like to talk about later in the show is the Italian coup, right? We've just had a coup by the International Monetary Fund and the European Central Bank in Italy. We've just gone from a prime minister by the name of Monti, who represents the Bilderberg Group, then the Trilateral Commission, and his replacement is a member of the Democratic Party, the PD, the Social Democrats or the Neo-Communists, who also represents the Bilderberg and Trilateral. So we'll be back with more about that in just a minute on the Webster Tarpley Program. I'm here on Unbound Radio. Now I want to direct your attention, as always, to tarpley.net. Tarpley.net, that is the touchstone for keeping up with world events and making some sense out of them. Understand what's going on around you at tarpley.net. And indeed, in times like these, when things are moving fast, take a look at Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed, which you should follow. And I'm happy to announce that I just passed the 11,000 mark this past week. 11,000 people get these Twitters when I put them out. And it's a very broad range of stuff. Some things you won't find anywhere else. Other things are the fruits of, other aggregations of other things. But tarpley.net on the website, and then Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Now, Italy has therefore gone from a prime minister, Monti, an austerity ghoul, who has increased unemployment by 2 full percentage points in a period of just a little bit over 14, 15 months. And now we've got Enrico Letta, L-E-T-T-A, who is, like Monti, a member of the Bilderberg and the Trilateral. And this is very interesting to see how this works. All of this takes place under the auspices of President Napolitano. Now, we don't know whether he's a relative of Janet Napolitano, but this is President Napolitano of Italy is a former communist. Henry Kissinger once described him as my